Alright, so this is the 6th video in my How to Play Yu-Gi-Oh series, and in this video I'm going to be talking about some intermediate strategies for the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'd like to start off this video by talking about matches and side decking. So, when you play Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments, whether it be a larger tournament or just a small local tournament, the format is played out in matches, which is best of 3, and for games 2 and 3, you get to use your side deck. So each player is allowed to play up to 15 cards into side deck. And so between game 1 and 2, you're allowed to swap out any of your cards in your main deck or extra deck for cards that are in your side deck. And you have to have the same number of cards in your extra and main deck as you do before siding. Meaning if you put 1 card into your extra deck and 3 cards into your main deck, you'll have to take out 1 from your extra deck and 3 from your main deck. You're also allowed to side once again between games 2 and 3. And you can play up to 15 cards in your side deck. So when you're siding, there's a few things to keep in mind. The most important thing is you do not want to side out your engine. So if you're playing ninjas, Hanzo is a key part of your engine, so you never want to side out any Hanzos. Because of this, it's important to understand which cards are important in your deck's engine. You also usually do not want to set out consistency cards, like Pot of Duality helps make your deck more consistent by searching through your next 3 cards. So cards like that you usually want to leave in if possible. Though that's not as much of an ironclad rule as not setting out your engine. An example of a card that you could potentially side out is something like Mirror Force, a card that's not critical for your engine usually. Usually this card is very matchup dependent as to how good it is because it's played specifically to counter your opponent. The most common thing that are sided in for games 2 and 3 are Floodgates. So Floodgates are a type of Yu-Gi-Oh card that basically prevent your opponent's strategy from functioning. They're called Floodgates because as long as they're up, your opponent can't usually do anything. But as soon as they're removed, then your opponent's plays will all become available to them. And Floodgates can be anything from monsters, spells, or traps, though usually if they're spell or traps, they have to be continuous. And monsters tend to have continuous effects as well. So, for example, Fossil Dyna prevents special summons, so this will stop decks that need to special summon. Dimensional Fissure banishes all monsters that go to the graveyard, so this stops decks that are reliant on the graveyard. And then Light Imprisoning Mirror negates the effects of light monsters that activate on the field and in the grave. So this is a counter to light decks. The next thing I want to talk about is who goes first when you're playing matches. So for game 1, usually you will roll a die to see who goes first. Whoever rolls the higher number will get to go first. Basically, you just have to choose a way that's random. So there are various ways that you can do this. You can play rock, paper, scissors, you can toss a dice. But rolling a die or 2 dice is widely accepted as the main method of determining who goes first for game 1. For games 2 and 3, whoever lost the previous game gets to choose if they want to go first or second. So there are advantages to going both first and second, so it's important to understand which number you want to go with your deck. So the primary advantages of going second are you get the extra draw to start your turn, and you get to attack on your first turn. And then the primary advantage of going first is that your opponent does not have any cards on the field before you have a chance to put cards on the field. So primarily decks that like to go first are control decks. Usually decks that are trap heavy will like to go first so they can set their traps before their opponent gets to go. Also, decks that can summon boss monsters that can help prevent your opponent from doing things once their turn starts. And the decks that like to go second tend to be cards that either prefer to have more cards, which are mainly combo-based decks. For example, windups. Most of these cards need to have 2 cards together to do anything, so having more cards increases the odds that you'll draw cards that work well together. Or aggressive decks, like Shaddolls, that can put a lot of damage on board quickly, tend to like to go second because they are allowed to attack during their first turn. The next concept I want to talk about is card advantage. So, card advantage is the main way that you can tell who has an advantage in a duel. Card advantage is more important than life points in terms of determining who is doing better. And so that's a mistake that a lot of new players will make, overvaluing life points. And, for example, a card like Ukazi does 800 damage to your opponent and then goes to the graveyard. So you're giving up one card of card advantage, and all you're doing is inflicting life point damage. So this isn't worth it, because card advantage is generally worth more than life points. And as a reverse example, Soul Charge allows you to special summon up to 5 monsters, paying 1,000 life points for each. So this card gives up a lot of life points, but will net you more cards than you started with. Say you summon 3 monsters from your grave, you just gain 2 cards, so that's a +2. So even though you're paying 3,000 life points, that's worth it, in most cases. Other cards like Upstart Goblin, this is bad in terms of life points, but it's actually neutral in terms of card advantage. So you give up Upstart Goblin by activating it, but you're drawing 1 card, so you +0. And in the process of activating this card, you give your opponent 1,000 life points. But that's not really important because you're not too concerned about life points. The main way that a lot of players manage to generate card advantage is actually just through battle. So say you have a Hanzo on the field and your opponent has a Wind-Up Shark. Just attacking over their monster will give you a +1 because you destroy their card. Losing monsters in battle loses card advantage, so for that reason, it's very helpful to try to play monsters that replace themselves. So for example, Hanzo will search you a card when he's summoned, so he's a +1 when you summon him. So even if he gets destroyed later, you're taking a -1, but that's just offsetting the +1 that you got when you summoned him. This is called being a floater. The more common type of floater is something like Skarm. When this card is sent to the graveyard, it will replace itself by searching your deck for a card. So committing this to the field has very little risk because you can easily replace it if your opponent destroys it. And as an example of another bad card, just because of card advantage, it usually doesn't work out well, is Lightning Vortex. This is a type of card that seems good to beginner players, but is really not. So what you do with Lightning Vortex is you discard 1 card from your hand, and then destroy all face-up monsters your opponent controls. So that means you're giving up 2 cards to destroy all monsters your opponent controls. That means they have to have more than 2 for this card to be advantageous to you. And those monsters also have to not be floaters. And during Yu-Gi-Oh, this is not often the case. So Lightning Vortex is rarely actually worth it. The other main factor in terms of determining who has an advantage in Yu-Gi-Oh is called tempo. So tempo is a lot harder to define than card advantage. Tempo basically is whoever is doing better at controlling the pace of the duel. And so some cards are actually not the best for card advantage, but they're still good cards because they're so good at tempo. One example of this is Phoenix Wing Wind Blast. This card you have to discard 1 card to activate, and it only gets rid of 1 of your opponent's cards. So it's technically a -1 in terms of card advantage, but it's really good for tempo because you can activate this at any point, which means that you have the flexibility to activate Phoenix Wing Wind Blast whenever it will hurt your opponent the most. Additionally, this card also puts the card that you're getting rid of from your opponent on top of their deck. So that means next turn they'll draw that card instead of the next card on their deck, which basically means they have 1 less potential resource to work with. Some cards that I already mentioned earlier in siding were Floodgates. So Floodgates are actually really good for tempo because when your opponent can't make their plays, they basically can't play with the tempo they want to. And if you can, then you'll have a large advantage over your opponent. And a big thing to consider with tempo is field presence. So if you have a strong monster on the board that's difficult for your opponent to get rid of, then that's pretty good for tempo because your opponent has to deal with this or they risk losing to you just attacking them with it. And cards that can clear the board are pretty good for tempo usually because they answer your opponent's field and allow you to try to put pressure on your opponent by summoning a field while they have none anymore. So cards like these used to be good in terms of card advantage, but now because most of the monsters you're destroying float, cards that destroy all your opponent's monsters are actually better for tempo. but they still do have a good place in the game because of that. The one thing to worry about here, though, is overextending. So you have to make sure that you have a follow-up play if your opponent has an answer to your field. So you have to consider both your field advantage and your hand advantage. Field advantage puts a lot of pressure on your opponent, but if you give up all of your hand advantage to create a large field, then if your opponent answers your field with something like Regeki or Mirror Force, then you could be in a tough position. So try not to overextend and try to always have a backup play just in case. So the next concept I want to talk about is deck thinning. If you have a smaller deck, then the odds of drawing your best cards, like Soul Charge, increase. And for this reason, it's usually good to have as small of a deck as possible, which is why you only play a 40-card deck for almost everything. And this is also why cards that deck thin are particularly good, because you have one less card in your deck after activating them. So with cards like this, usually you just have to balance the downsides. So with Upstart Goblin, you deck them by 1, but your opponent has 1,000 extra life points, so you have to decide whether or not that's worth it. And then Duality, you cannot special summon the turn you activate it, but your deck is thinner by 1. So again, you just have to balance the reward versus the cost with something like that. The only reason why you really wouldn't want to deck thin is certain decks, like Ninjas, for example, have cards you want to keep in the deck. Ninjutsu Art of Transformation can special summon Apex Avian from your deck, so you'd never want to draw Apex Avian. And for this reason, playing something like Upstart Goblin is usually not worth it in Ninjas. So that's really the main reason why you would ever not want to deck thin, is if you have cards you want to keep in your deck. Something I want to mention is Jar of Greed. So Jar of Greed on the surface looks like an Upstart Goblin. Both of them just draw you one card, so it would deck thin by 1. But the problem with Jar of Greed is it's a trap, so you have to set it and wait a turn to activate it, which means it's too slow to effectively deck thin. Upstart Goblin immediately replaces itself the turn you draw it. Jar of Greed is not replace itself until your following turn, so you're basically -1 for that turn until you can activate it. The next thing I want to talk about is card ratios. So this concept refers to how many copies of each card you should play in your deck. So usually search cards, stuff like that, you'll want to max out. But the important thing to consider with this is how many search targets you have. Usually if you're playing 3 copies of a search card, at the minimum you want to play 3 copies of whatever you're searching for. And usually you'll want to play 1 or 2 of another potential search target. So usually you'll want to max out your search card and then max out the best card that it can search for, and then play a few copies of other targets. Another important thing to consider is if you want to draw more than 1 card at a time. So cards like Pot of Duality, you can only activate 1 per turn. So that means if you have extras, they're dead until your next turn. So this is a reason why you might not want to play more than 1 Pot of Duality. You might not want to draw into more than 1. However, Pot of Duality is an example of a good card, so sometimes you will actually play all 3. Sometimes you'll choose to play just 2 to try to minimize drawing doubles, but at the same time increasing your odds of drawing 1. Another important thing to consider is how many normal summons you have. So Hanzo is an example of a monster that you generally have to normal summon to get it out of your hand. And if you have more than 1 monster in your hand that needs to be normal summoned, then they're dead until the following turns, because you only have 1 normal summon per turn. So that means you usually do not want to play too many monsters that you have to normal summon. I try to keep it below 10. I don't think that you should play more than that, unless you have a way of getting rid of them from your deck or your hand without having to normal summon them. Another important thing to consider is how many monsters you run versus how many spells and traps you run. So if you have too many monsters, you won't draw anything but monsters. Sometimes you can be fine with decks that are mostly monsters, but you will often need to be able to special summon them or discard them from your hand to make proper use of them in those types of decks. And then in other types of decks, sometimes you will play a large spell and trap card count, usually traps. But in this, you have to be concerned that you won't draw any monsters to summon. So there's a balance there that you have to try to strike. So usually you want to have at least 12 to 13 monsters at minimum, which can work in some trap heavy decks, all the way up to about 30 monsters maximum if you're running a really monster heavy deck with lots of special summons. But usually you want it to be somewhere in the middle of that. Another important concept is toolboxing. So toolboxing is how you search for whichever card is ideal to help you get out of whichever situation you're in. So most decks can't main deck toolbox, but some of them, if they have a good search card, like Rhoda searches for whatever warrior monsters you have in your deck, something that's a good searcher like this will allow you to toolbox your main deck for answers to your current situation. However, more common nowadays is extra deck toolboxing. Say you can go into a rank 4 because you can easily summon level 4 monsters. You can summon a wide variety of rank 4 Exceed monsters to help you solve whatever problem you're in. Or if you can go into a synchro because you're playing tuners, then you can say toolbox level 8 synchro monsters. So since these monsters are in your extra deck, you don't have to risk drawing them at bad times, and they're always available if you have the correct monsters on the field to go into them. So extra deck toolboxing is a very powerful tool that you can use to help get you out of lots of different situations. The next topic I want to cover is order of operations. So this refers to the correct order to play cards in, and this is very specific for each deck, so you'll have to learn what's the correct order to play cards in your own deck. So just as an example, if in your ninja deck you open up with Reinforcement of the Army and a Pot of Duality, Pot of Duality will only be able to give you one of the top 3 cards, while Reinforcement of the Army gives you specifically Hanzo in this case, because that's the card you almost always want to search for. So the correct order to activate these two in is activating this one first, because in this example you can activate Rhoda to search for Hanzo, then you can normal summon it because you know this is the monster you want to summon this turn, search your deck for a Ninjutsu Art of Transformation, and then afterwards you can activate Pot of Duality. In this case, you have less of a chance of getting a transformation or a Hanzo in your top 3 cards because you have one less in your deck now. And since you were going to get these cards anyways off of your Reinforcement of the Army, you wanted to activate that before you activated your Duality. Another important concept in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is you want to set trap cards during your main phase 2, generally. This is because it's better to summon your monsters and then attack your opponent to see if your opponent has any responses to either summoning or attacking before you commit cards to the field that you might not want to commit to the field after the battle phase is over. The last thing I want to talk about is shuffling. So when you side deck, you'll be putting, say you want to side in 5 cards, you want these to be spread out evenly among your deck, so you don't want to put them all on top of your deck and start shuffling, because then they'll be grouped together when you're shuffling. You want to spread them out evenly throughout your deck. So, in theory, shuffling your deck should get the top 5 cards mixed up anyways, but this gives you a head start when you're shuffling. This also applies to when you activate stuff like Jar of Avarice, which will shuffle 5 cards into your deck. Another thing I want to talk about shuffling is the best way to shuffle, in my experience, is to shuffle like this, sideways. But this way you don't really damage the cards. When people play with playing cards versus Yu-Gi-Oh cards, a lot of times people will take them and they'll bend them like this. I'm not going to do this because this is Yu-Gi-Oh cards, but that bends the cards, and you don't really want to do that. And one way that I like to do, I shuffle once this way between each game usually, it's called pile shuffling. So you put the cards into piles, and you just do this for the entire deck. And this way, your cards get pretty thoroughly mixed up. This is very helpful if you have cards that will search out cards so they end up all together. for example, in my ninja deck, usually all my monsters will end up being used during the course of the duel, so I'll have mostly trap cards left in my deck, because I can search most of my monsters from my deck. So this way my monsters are more evenly spread out throughout my deck. So this was the video on some intermediate strategy for the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! My next video will be discussing the Forbidden and Limited list.